Imagine for a second that you decide to read a comprehensive, like a really deeply detailed history of the American Civil War.
Okay.
You go to the library, you check out this massive authoritative volume. You sit down, you crack the spine, and you are ready for the grand narrative.
Right, you're ready for the big story.
Yeah, you're ready for Gettysburg, you're ready for Bull Run, the March to the Sea. But as you start reading, like the very first chapter, you realize something incredibly strange. Every single major battle described in this book takes place in Canada.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so the Union and Confederate troops are just like marching through Ontario.
Exactly.
They're setting up artillery in Quebec, fighting bitterly over the St. Lawrence River, which is, nowhere near the actual Mason-Dixon line.
Right. And as a reader, you would instantly stop and think, wait a minute. How do I make sense of this geographic impossibility?
You couldn't.
No. Why on earth are the Union and Confederate armies clashing in the suburbs of Toronto? It would completely shatter your understanding of the entire conflict.
Because the location of a war isn't just, it's not just trivia.
Exactly.
The geography dictates the politics, it dictates the supply lines, the entire reason the war is being fought in the first place. You couldn't just keep reading and ignore it.
No, you really couldn't. It forces a total paradigm shift.
Yeah.
You can't just accept the events described in the text without profoundly questioning the map itself.
Right. If the map is wrong, the foundational premise of the entire story has to be reevaluated from the ground up.
And that geographic anomaly, that jarring, undeniable sense of, like, wait, the map doesn't match the story, is exactly where we are starting today.
It is.
Welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today, for everyone listening, is to explore a groundbreaking and frankly massive historical reconstruction. And this is entirely formulated by Dr. Khaled Waleed.
It's a huge undertaking.
It really is. We're taking a fascinating stack of early historical texts, archaeological data, linguistic analyses, and geographical surveys to unpack Dr. Waleed's framework.
And this theory is, it's an absolute titan. Dr. Waleed argues that the origins of Islam did not occur in the deep, isolated deserts of the Hijaz, in the cities we know today as Mecca and Medina.
Right, which is the standard story.
Exactly. He argues it actually happened on the heavily contested Byzantine borders of the Levant.
It is a radical reimagining of the ancient map, and it completely shifts the geopolitical center of gravity of the 7th century.
It does. But to build a case of this magnitude, the framework doesn't just rely on, one controversial piece of evidence.
Or a single retranslated word, right?
Right. It pulls from the absolute earliest non-Islamic texts. We are talking about documents like the Doctrina Jacobi, the writings of the Armenian bishop Sebios, and the Chronicles of Thomas the Presbyter.
And these are old.
Very old. All of which were written right around the time the actual events were unfolding. And then this reconstruction combines those external accounts with the earliest Islamic histories from figures like Tabari and Waqidi.
So it's using the internal Islamic sources, too.
Exactly. And finally, it layers in hard material evidence. So Umayyad coinage, early administrative papyri, and the architectural research of Dan Gibson regarding the literal physical direction of the earliest mosques.
Okay, we are going to unpack all of this because I know that setting up a premise, this huge, a premise that challenges what billions of people understand about world history, it requires some very clear ground rules.
Absolutely. And here is our clear disclaimer for you, the listener, as we begin pulling this apart.
Yeah, please state it clearly.
In this deep dive, we are going to impartially report on Dr. Waleed's specific historical theory. We are going to explore the fascinating internal logic, the mechanics, and the sheer architectural scale of this reconstruction.
Right.
We are not taking sides, and we are certainly not endorsing or validating the religious or political shifts that this framework implies.
Our sole objective is to just, map out the thought process here and see exactly how the historical dots are connected to form this alternative picture.
Precisely. Because whether you ultimately agree with Dr. Waleed's conclusions or not, the way this puzzle is reassembled is objectively fascinating.
It changes how you think about how history is written.
It really does.
So let's start right at the scene of the action. The geographic anomaly. If you want to figure out what happened in the 7th century, you have to look at where the earliest recorded events physically took place. Right?
Yes.
You look for the primary sources.
Exactly. You have to look at the earliest testimonies from outside the traditional later historical narrative. You look for texts written by people who were quite literally watching these events unfold in real time or dealing with the immediate aftermath.
Right.
And the first crucial document Dr. Waleed points us to is called the Doctrina Jacobi. This was written around 634 AD.
Wait, 634. So we are talking literally within a couple of years of the traditional date of Muhammad's death, which is usually cited as 632 AD, right?
Yes, exactly.
This is as contemporary as ancient history gets.
It really is. It's a Greek Christian text, and it mentions a, quote, prophet who has appeared with the Saracens.
Okay.
Now, the Doctrina Jacobi is writing from the perspective of people experiencing a sudden, violent upheaval. But what is key here is the geography. The text describes these events happening in the context of the Byzantine Levant.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, when they say Saracens, that's the Byzantine term for the Arab tribes, right?
Yes, specifically the Arab tribes on the borders of the Byzantine Empire.
Okay.
It wasn't just a catch-all term for anyone living in a desert somewhere. It had a specific geopolitical connotation for the Romans. Got it. Then you move forward slightly to Thomas the Presbyter in 640 AD. He writes a Syriac chronicle, and he specifically notes that the Arabs of Muhammad entered Palestine and Syria. He describes a battle that took place near Gaza.
Near Gaza.
And then moving to 660 AD, you have Sabaeus, the Armenian. Sabaeus gives some fascinating details about this movement, but he ties the narrative directly to the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius and the massive geopolitical struggle over the conquest of Jerusalem.
And if you're listening closely, this is where the puzzle pieces start to look really, really strange.
Very strange.
Because none of these contemporary, on-the-ground observers, people writing in Greek, in Syriac, in Armenian, right as the events are happening, none of them mention Mecca.
No.
They don't mention Medina. They don't mention the Hijaz, which is, the deep desert region of the Arabian Peninsula.
Not a single mention. And Dr. Waleed's framework heavily emphasizes this absence of evidence.
It's a loud silence.
It's a very loud silence. These contemporary writers place the event squarely on the borders of the Levant. So modern-day Jordan, Israel, Palestine, Syria.
Right.
They do not describe a massive, completely foreign invasion launching from a deep desert hundreds of miles to the south. They describe something happening right in their own backyard.
But wait, if you are looking at the early Islamic historians, like the people who actually wrote the traditional biography of the Prophet, like Ibn Ishaq or Waqidi or Tabari, surely they place these early foundational battles down in the deep desert, right?
Well,
because that is the standard narrative. The battles of Badr, Uhud, the skirmishes with desert tribes.
Well, this is where Dr. Waleed's analysis gets really forensic with the Islamic sources themselves. When you look at the documented early military conflicts, particularly the outward-facing ones detailed by Waqidi and Tabari, look at where they physically occurred.
Okay, where?
You have the expedition to Dat Atla. Where is that? It's in southern Jordan on the road to Petra. You have the famous Battle of Muta, that is just east of the Jordan River near the Dead Sea.
Right.
You have the expedition to Tabuk.
Now, Tabuk is often framed as this massive, grueling march into the hostile nowhere.
Right. It is framed that way later, yeah. But look at the actual geography. Tabuk is on the direct road to the Levant. It was a well-known northern border town. According to the geographers of the time, Tabuk had springs, it had palm trees. It was deeply connected to the trade routes feeding into the Byzantine sphere. It wasn't some remote, isolated dune.
So let me just try to visualize this. If we take a map and we put a red pin in every single location mentioned by the non-Muslim contemporary sources, and then we put a blue pin in the major early expeditions mentioned by the Muslim historians, what does that map actually look like?
According to this reconstruction, if you overlay all those pins, you do not see a massive desert campaign originating from Central Arabia.
What do you see?
You see a remarkably tight, highly concentrated theater of operations. Everything is happening within a roughly 200-kilometer radius around Petra and Jerusalem.
Wow, just 200 kilometers.
Yep. The deduction here is that these were not invasions launched by a newly united desert people marching thousands of miles north. These were daily, localized border wars.
Yeah.
The entire theater of operations, the entire crucible of early Islam, according to Dr. Waleed, is situated in the Levant.
Okay, I have to push back here and push back hard. Let's say I accept the geography for a minute. The traditional history doesn't just say they fought in the north. It explicitly names who they were fighting.
Right.
They were fighting the Byzantine Romans.
Oh.
That is the whole story of the early conquests.
Yes.
But if Dr. Waleed is placing Muhammad and his early followers already in the Levant, essentially functioning as part of the Byzantine border guard, why on earth would they fight their own side?
That is the big question.
You can't just flip the map to make the geography work if the geopolitical math totally breaks down. Like, why would a Byzantine border patrol attack the Byzantine Empire?
That is exactly the right question to ask, and it is the specific pivot point of this entire historical reconstruction.
Okay, lay it on me.
To answer why they were fighting, Dr. Waleed argues that we can't just look at the map distantly. We have to completely redefine who was fighting.
Who was fighting?
Yeah, we have to flip the geopolitical map just as much as the physical one. We have to understand the true superpowers of the 6th and 7th centuries.
All right, I am in. Let's redefine the players. Who is actually on the board here?
The central thesis of Dr. Waleed's framework is this. The foundational figures of early Islam were not isolated desert pagans.
Okay.
Muhammad, according to this reconstruction, was a Christian Ghassanid from a heavily contested region called Palestina II.
Palestina is it?
Right, which roughly corresponds to the modern-day Levant, specifically around the Golan Heights area.
Okay, let's stop right there. A Christian Ghassanid. We really need to define the Ghassanids because they seem crucial to this entire theory.
They are the key.
Looking at the history, these guys weren't just wandering nomadic tribes looking for water, right? They were basically Rome's heavily armed outsourced border patrol. They were the muscle.
That is an excellent way to describe them. The Ghassanids were a powerful Arab tribal confederation that operated as the formal allies or, federates of the Byzantine Empire.
That's right.
The Byzantine Empire, which was centered in Constantinople, realized it was incredibly expensive and difficult to maintain traditional Roman legions in the arid, shifting borders of the Syrian desert.
It's just a logistical nightmare.
Exactly. So they outsourced it. They paid the Ghassanids in gold and titles to be their buffer state.
So they are carrying Roman weapons, operating with Roman intelligence, but maintaining their own Arab tribal structures.
Exactly. And crucially, they were Christians.
Right.
But not just any Christians. The Ghassanids were specifically Monophysite, which is also known as Jacobite Christians.
Monophysite. Okay, that sounds like a theological distinction that's going to cause problems later.
Oh, it causes massive problems later. We will get into why that specific theological flavor matters so much. But for now, just know they were deeply embedded in the religious and political fabric of the Christian Byzantine world. They were the powerhouse Arab proxy for Byzantium in the 6th century.
Okay, so if the Ghassanids are this massive, heavily armed shield guarding the eastern Byzantine borders, who were they guarding those borders from? Like, you don't build a shield unless someone is swinging a very big sword at you.
No, you don't. Their natural enemies, the people swinging that sword, were not the Byzantines. Their mortal generational enemies were the Sassanid Empire.
The Persians.
Yes, the Zoroastrian Sassanid Persians. The Sassanids were the other great global superpower of late antiquity.
Right, the big rivals.
Exactly. And just like the Byzantines had the Ghassanids to fight their desert wars, the Sassanids had their own fiercely loyal Arab proxies. These were the Lakhmids.
The Lakhmids.
The Lakhmids were based in a major city called Al-Hira, which is located in modern-day Iraq near the Euphrates.
So what we are looking at is effectively a massive proxy war, a Cold War that frequently went hot.
A very hot Cold War, yes.
You've got the Byzantine Empire backing the Ghassanid Arabs in the west, and the Sassanid Persian Empire backing the Lakhmid Arabs in the east. And these two Arab confederations are just smashing into each other across the desert for decades.
Exactly. It was the geopolitical fault line of the ancient world. But Dr. Waleed's framework adds a deeply documented, absolutely critical layer to this Sassanid Lakhmid camp.
What's the layer?
A massive, highly integrated Jewish alliance. Dr. Waleed pulls from extensive historical and archaeological records to show that the Sassanid and Lakhmid networks were structurally bound to Jewish populations and leadership throughout the Middle East.
Now that is interesting, because usually when we hear about this era, the different religious groups are treated as entirely separate silos. Like they don't mix at all.
Right, but they did.
How deep of an alliance are we talking about between the Zoroastrian Persians, the Arab Lakhmids, and the Jewish populations?
We are talking about deep structural integration that went all the way up to the royal courts. Yeah, let's look at the Lakhmids in Al-Hira, the Sassanid proxies. Their most famous, most powerful king was a man named Al-Numan bin al-Mundhir. His mother was Jewish, hailing from the prominent agricultural and trade centers of Khaybar or Fadak.
Wait, Khaybar? The same Khaybar that features so heavily in early Islamic history as a major Jewish stronghold.
The very same. And Al-Hira itself, the Lakhmid capital, wasn't just a military base. It was a major economic hub for Jewish craftsmen, merchants, and scholars.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they managed vast sectors of the economy under the protection of the Sassanid state.
So the Lakhmid king essentially has Jewish roots, and his capital is economically dependent on Jewish trade networks. That makes sense. It's a pragmatic alliance.
It is, but it goes even higher than that. As we look up the chain of command from the Lakhmids to the Sassanid Empire itself, the integration is astonishing.
How so?
The Sassanid royalty heavily intermarried with Jewish leadership. Take Queen Shishanda. She was the wife of the Sassanid Emperor Yazdegerd I. She was Jewish.
The Empress of Persia was Jewish.
Yes. And not just nominally Jewish, she was the daughter of the Jewish exilarch.
The exilarch. What exactly is that role? I've heard the term, but how does it function in a Zoroastrian empire?
So the exilarch was the secular leader of the Jewish community in exile in Babylon.
Okay.
But within the Sassanid system, the exilarch functioned almost like an official Jewish ministry within the state apparatus. They handled tax collection for their communities, they ran rabbinical courts, they had official state standing.
Wow.
So when the Sassanid emperor marries the exilarch's daughter, he is cementing a massive political and economic treaty.
He is bringing an entire domestic population into the imperial fold.
Precisely. And the offspring of that union, Queen Shushandak's son, became King Bahram V. According to Jewish religious law, he was Jewish through his mother.
Okay, this is fascinating.
And guess where this future emperor of Persia was sent to be raised and educated?
Let me guess. Al-Hira.
Yes, he was raised in Al-Hira under the tutelage of the Lakhmid Arab kings.
Oh, wow. Okay, you are really painting a picture here. This isn't just a political alliance of convenience where they sign a piece of paper and go their separate ways.
No, not at all.
It is familial. It is economic. It is structural. The Zoroastrian emperor, the Arab proxy kings, and the Jewish exilarch are practically one big, extended political family.
It is an entire cohesive geopolitical bloc. They share resources, they share intelligence, and they share enemies. And this entire bloc moves together.
Yeah, okay, so when do they move?
Which brings us to the pivotal historical event in this entire chronological reconstruction. The year is 614 AD. The Cold War goes hot in a way the world had never seen.
614 AD. What happens?
The Sassanids launch a massive invasion of the Byzantine Levant, and they are aided, according to historical chronicles, by an estimated 20,000 to 26,000 Jewish rebels who join the Persian advance.
Because the Jewish populations in the Levant have been brutally repressed by the Byzantine Christians for centuries, right?
Yeah.
So when the Persians show up, they are seen as liberators.
Exactly. The Sassan-Lakhmid Jewish alliance marches into the Levant. They lay siege to Jerusalem. And in 614 AD, they sack the city.
Holy city falls.
It falls. It is a catastrophic event for the Byzantine world. They massacre the Christian defenders, they burn the churches, and the ultimate psychological blow, they steal the true cross and take it back to Persia.
Okay, my mind is racing right now.
Oh.
Because when you explain the history with this level of interconnectivity, like an analogy is forming in my head.
What's the analogy?
It feels like we just discovered the mechanics of a massive hidden universe.
Yeah.
Like the traditional story of early Islam, the way it is taught, always felt to me a bit like a desert western. You have a small, isolated group of people in the sands of the Hijaz fighting local tribal skirmishes, raiding caravans, completely disconnected from the rest of the planet.
Right, very localized.
But this framework is saying, no, pull the camera way, way back.
Right.
What you're actually looking at is an epic geopolitical clash of massive world empires, and the center of the chessboard is Jerusalem.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. It shifts the scale from tribal to imperial. And Dr. Waleed argues that you can actually see this epic imperial clash documented directly in the text of the Quran itself if you understand the correct historical context.
Wait, really? Where?
Let's take one of the most famous events in Islamic history, the Battle of the Trench, also known in Arabic as Al-Azab.
Al-Azab.
Which translates to the Battle of the Confederates, or the Combined Forces.
Right. And traditional history places the Battle of the Trench as a skirmish around Medina. The story goes that the Meccan pagans and their allies laid siege to Medina, and the Muslims dug a literal trench in the desert sand to stop the cavalry. It's a very famous story.
It is. But Dr. Waleed synthesizes the evidence and says, this narrative doesn't fit the scale of what is described in the text, nor does it fit the geopolitical reality of the time.
So what was it?
He argues that the Battle of the Trench was not a skirmish in a desert town. It was the desperate defense of Jerusalem against this massive Sassanid Lathmid Jewish confederation.
Defending Jerusalem. How does the text actually support that?
The framework points to specific Quranic descriptions of this battle. The text describes the enemy being brought down from their siyasi.
Siyasi. I don't speak Arabic. What is the literal translation of that?
It translates to fortresses, specifically massive multi-level stone defenses or songholds. Dr. Waleed argues that digging a ditch in the sand outside an unwalled oasis town like Medina does not require the enemy to be brought down from multi-tiered stone fortresses.
Oh, it doesn't.
But that description perfectly, flawlessly matches the massive, ancient, multi-tiered stone fortifications of Jerusalem. Furthermore, the Quran describes the enemy coming from above and below.
Meaning verticality.
Yes, a verticality that makes perfect sense in the mountainous, highly fortified topography of Jerusalem, but very little sense in the flat plains of the Hijaz.
So in this reconstruction, the Ghassanids, including the historical figure of Muhammad, were not defending Medina from Meccan pagans. They were the Byzantine allied forces desperately defending Jerusalem from the Sassanid superpower.
That is exactly the argument. The early Muslims were the Monophysite Ghassanid Arabs holding the line for the Byzantine Empire against the Persian Confederacy.
Okay, this is brilliant, but it immediately raises a massive logical problem.
Let's hear it.
If the Sassanids and the Lakhmids were the great enemy attacking Jerusalem, where does the Byzantine emperor fit into the rest of the story? Because we know from the history books that the early Islamic State eventually fates the Byzantines.
Yes, they do.
The Arabs conquer Syria from the Romans. How does Dr. Waleed's framework explain the transition from being loyal border guards to overthrowing the empire?
To understand the transition, you first have to understand the height of the alliance. Because according to this theory, the Byzantine emperor Heraclius doesn't start out as the villain.
He doesn't.
No, he starts out as the great hero, the sovereign savior. And again, Dr. Waleed points to the Quran for evidence. Look at Surah Ar-Rum, the chapter of the Romans.
Okay, what does it say?
It starts with a very famous verse. The Romans were defeated in the lowest land, but after their defeat, they will overcome. And on that day, the believers will rejoice.
Now, I have always heard that verse framed as a prophecy, like a prediction of a far-off battle between two foreign superpowers that the Muslims in the desert just happened to care about for some reason.
Right, but ask yourself, why would isolated desert tribesmen whose primary concern was local survival rejoice over the geopolitical victory of the Roman Empire?
It does seem a bit out of place.
Dr. Waleed says the context is much more immediate and personal. The believers mentioned in the verse, who he identifies as the Monophysite Ghassanids, are going to rejoice because their ally, their imperial backer, Heraclius, is finally pushing back and defeating their mortal enemy, the Sassanids, who just sacked their holy city.
And historically, that pushback happens, right? Heraclius doesn't just roll over.
No, he pulls off one of the greatest military comebacks in ancient history. Heraclius reorganizes his forces, bypasses the Persian armies in the Levant, and strikes directly into the heart of the Sassanid Empire. He crushes them. He recovers the stolen true cross, and in 630 AD, he marches triumphantly back into Jerusalem. The believers rejoice, just as the verse says.
So in 630 AD, the Ghassanid Arabs and the Byzantine Romans are on the exact same side. They are victorious allies standing in Jerusalem.
Very much so. And to cement this relationship, the framework re-examines a famous diplomatic event. Around 628 AD, right as the tide of the war is turning, Muhammad sends a letter to Heraclius, delivered by an envoy named Dia al-Kalbi.
Okay, I know this story. The traditional narrative usually frames this letter as a bold, almost arrogant ultimatum from a new desert prophet to the Roman emperor, like, submit to Islam or I will conquer you.
Yes, that is the later interpretation, but Dr. Waleed analyzes the actual wording that has been preserved. To Heraclius, the great of the Romans.
That sounds pretty polite.
He argues that this is not a declaration of war from an unknown desert chieftain. The tone is deeply respectful of Byzantine hierarchy. It is a diplomatic communication from a loyal Ghassanid leader to his Byzantine sovereign.
So what's the purpose of the letter then?
It is a call for a unified monotheistic alliance, bringing the Arabs and the Romans together in true faith uniting against the defeated Zoroastrian Sassanids. It's a victory lap and a proposal for a new, unified religious order under the empire.
That makes incredible sense in the context of 630 AD, but obviously it goes wrong, because within a decade, the Arabs and the Byzantines are slaughtering each other.
They are.
So what is the pivot? If Heraclius is the hero, What is the betrayal in this timeline? Why does the empire turn on its own shield?
The betrayal happens shortly after Heraclius' great triumph in Jerusalem. You have to remember, the Byzantine Empire had just survived a multi-decade near-apocalyptic war.
Right.
The state was bankrupt, the infrastructure was ruined, and the population was traumatized. Heraclius needed absolute unity to rebuild his empire. And in the 7th century, political unity meant religious unity.
Because you can't have a fractured theology if you are trying to rebuild a centralized state.
Exactly. But there was a massive fracture. The official state religion in Constantinople was Chalcedonian Christianity.
What's that?
This theology believed that Christ had two distinct natures, human and divine. But the eastern provinces, Egypt, Syria, and crucially the Arab Ghassanids, were heavily monophysite. They believed Christ had one unified nature.
And let me guess, this isn't just an academic debate about the nature of Christ. People are willing to kill and die over this.
Absolutely. To Heraclius, the monophysites were heretics threatening the cohesion of his fragile, recovering empire. So, after 629 AD, he makes a fatal political miscalculation.
What does he do?
Instead of rewarding his Ghassanid allies for holding the line during the Persian War, he decides to enforce theological conformity. He demands they accept Chalcedonian Christianity. When they refuse, he actively persecutes them. Worse, he cuts off their stipends. He stops paying the very border guards who bled for him.
Wow, that is an astonishing betrayal. He turns his back on his own veterans over theological technicality.
He pushes them out of the imperial fold. Suddenly, the Ghassanids, who were loyal allies, find themselves branded as heretics, persecuted by their own emperor, and financially ruined. The ally becomes the enemy.
So they didn't invade the empire abandoned them, and they simply took over the territory they were already garrisoning.
Exactly, and this is where the framework makes a brilliant historiographical point. Dr. Waleed argues that the later historians, writing hundreds of years later under the Abbasid dynasty in Baghdad, took this very late conflict with Byzantium, a conflict that only started after 629 AD, due to this betrayal, and they retroactively projected it backward over Muhammad's entire life.
Oh, I see. It's like taking the final act of a movie where the hero and his mentor have a falling out and re-editing the entire film to pretend they hated each other from the opening scene.
That's exactly what it is.
They masked the original alliance to make it look like the Byzantines were the pagan-hating enemies from day one rather than former Christian allies.
Exactly. It's retroactive continuity. But this brings us to a huge, undeniable logistical problem that the framework has to solve.
Right. If the Byzantines and the Ghassanids have this falling out, and the Ghassanids, who Dr. Waleed says are the core of what will become the early Muslims rebel and take over,
Yeah.
what actually happened to the Byzantine state in the Levant?
Good question.
Like, if you conquer a territory like Syria, you have to run it. Did the Roman infrastructure just vanish into thin air and get replaced by desert nomads?
That is the beauty of Dr. Waleed's analysis of the material evidence. He says the Byzantine state in the Levant didn't collapse at all.
It didn't.
No, it didn't vanish. It wasn't burned to the ground. It merely put on an Arab cloak.
An Arab cloak. Explain the mechanics of that. Because usually when an empire falls, it's chaotic. It's the Dark Ages.
Not here. Think about what happens when a modern corporation gets subjected to a hostile takeover.
Okay.
They don't fire the accountants, they don't burn the ledgers, they just change the name on the door and the CEO at the top.
Yeah.
When the Umayyad dynasty, specifically under the leader Muawiyah, consolidated power in Damascus and established what we consider the first major Islamic empire, Dr. Waleed points out that they kept the Byzantine administrative apparatus completely intact.
So the same people who ran the taxes, the grain silos, and the bureaucracy for the Byzantine emperor just woke up on Monday and kept doing their jobs for the Umayyad Caliph.
Precisely. They were the same people. Greek remained the official language of the state bureaucracy until roughly 700 AD.
Wait, hold on. 700 AD. That is nearly 70 years after the traditional date of the Islamic conquests. For 3 generations, this new Arab empire is running its government in Greek.
Yes, because they didn't have to invent a new state. They just inherited the one they were already living in. Taxes were actually lowered in many places because they no longer had to send a cut to Constantinople, and a high degree of religious tolerance was practiced.
Incredible.
And to prove this seamless continuity, the framework highlights a specific, heavily documented family, the Mansur or Sarjan family tree.
Who are they? Walk us through their resume.
They were an aristocratic, highly educated Christian family living in Damascus. The grandfather of this family, a man named Mansur, was the chief financial officer. He managed the taxes for the Byzantine emperors Maurice and Heraclius.
Okay, so a high-level Roman bureaucrat.
Right. When the Arabs took over, his son, Sarjan, simply stepped into the role. Sarjan managed the taxes for the first Umayyad caliph, Muawiyah.
So the son works for the Arabs.
And Sarjan's son, the grandson of the original tax collector, grew up in the Umayyad court, was childhood friends with the caliph's son, and eventually became known to history as John of Damascus.
John of Damascus, as in the incredibly famous Christian theologian and saint. He was part of the Umayyad administration.
Yes, he served in the administration before retiring to a monastery. This one Christian family essentially ran the treasury of Damascus for 118 years, seamlessly bridging the transition from Roman Byzantine rule to Arab Islamic rule.
That is a staggering piece of evidence. It totally destroys the idea of a violent, civilization-ending conquest by primitive outsiders. It really does look more like a change of upper management by locals who are already integrated into the system.
And the material evidence from the ground supports this administrative continuity flawlessly. Dr. Waleed points to the early coins minted by Muawiyah in Damascus, known as Arab Byzantine coinage.
Coins are always the best evidence.
They are. If you are a new, radically different religious empire, the first thing you do is strike new coins to declare your ideology.
Right, you put your new symbols on the money.
But look at Muawiyah's coins. They feature the ruler standing, holding a Byzantine cross. The name Muawiyah is literally written in Greek letters. It is only much, much later, under later rulers, that the cross is removed and the Arabic phrase Bismillah begins to appear.
A coin minted by an Islamic caliph, featuring a Christian cross, a Greek name, and eventually Arabic script. That is a cultural hybrid if I have ever seen one. It shows a slow evolution, not an instant revolution.
Exactly. There is also documentary evidence like the PERF 558 papyrus found in Egypt, dated to 643 AD. It's an administrative receipt for sheep requisitioned for the Arab army, and it is written in both Greek and Arabic.
So they are fully bilingual.
Yes. It shows a totally pragmatic, bilingual administration operating just years after the supposed conquest. According to this framework, the Umayyad state in Damascus was not a foreign imposition. It was simply the Levantine Byzantine state continuing under Arab Ghassanid leadership.
Okay, the continuity argument is incredibly strong. It makes logical sense. But here is where it gets really interesting to me, and where I have to admit some genuine confusion.
Sure, what's confusing?
I need you to help me cross a bridge here. If the Umayyads were just continuing the Ghassanid and Byzantine state, and the Ghassanids, as we established, were monophysite Christians, how do we explain the massive religious shift?
The theology.
Yes. How do we get from a rebellious sect of Christianity to Islam as a completely distinct New World religion with its own holy book? Where is the theological break?
That is the most profound question in this entire deep dive. To answer it, Dr. Waleed dives deep into a linguistic and sociological analysis of the Quran itself and the early life of Muhammad.
Okay, let's get into the linguistics.
He argues that we have profoundly misunderstood key terms in the text because we have been forced to read them through the lens of later Abbasid historians rather than understanding them in their original 7th century Judeo-Christian Levantine context.
Give me an example of a misunderstood word that changes the theology.
Let's take one of the most famous descriptions of the prophet, the word ummi.
Right. In the traditional narrative, ummi is almost universally translated as illiterate. The tradition says Muhammad was an illiterate prophet, which makes the dictation of the Quran a literal linguistic miracle.
Yes, that is the later Orthodox interpretation. But Dr. Waleed, looking at the linguistic roots and how the word was used in that specific era, argues that ummi absolutely does not mean illiterate.
What does it mean?
In the Quranic context, he says it translates much closer to the Hebrew concept of Gentiles, or more accurately, the unscriptured.
The unscriptured, meaning what exactly?
Meaning people who do not yet possess a fixed, written, consolidated scripture in their own native language. Look at the context. The Jews had the Torah in Hebrew.
Right.
The Greeks had the Gospels in Greek. The Ghassanid Arabs were monotheists. They lived among Christians and Jews. They knew the biblical stories. They likely used fragments of Syriac scriptures in their liturgy. But they didn't have a codified, divine, holy book delivered specifically in Arabic.
Yeah.
They were ummi, meaning unscriptured Gentiles, not unlettered or uneducated men. They could read perfectly fine. They just didn't have their own book yet.
Wow. That completely changes the context of his early life. He goes from being an isolated, uneducated man in a pagan desert to being a literate, religiously aware figure living in a highly pluralistic, monotheistic society who feels his people are missing their own divine text.
It changes everything. And Dr. Waleed's framework goes further into his sociological environment. Let's look at Khadija, Muhammad's first wife and his greatest early supporter.
Okay.
Traditional history agrees she was a wealthy, noble woman. But look at her lineage. She belonged to the Banu Asad bin Abd al-Uzza. This was a well-known Christian clan.
A Christian clan?
Yes. Her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, is explicitly described even in Islamic tradition as a Christian priest who read the Gospels in Syriac or Hebrew.
So she is deeply embedded in the Christian elite of the era.
Exactly. And Dr. Waleed points out a crucial, undeniable sociological fact of the 6th century Levant. A noble, wealthy, well-connected Christian woman would absolutely not marry a pagan.
Right. The social cost would be too high.
The social and religious taboo would be insurmountable. Therefore, Muhammad must have originally been part of this monotheistic Judeo-Christian environment from the very beginning.
Right.
He was an insider, not an outsider.
Okay, so if he is a literate insider in this Christian Ghassanid environment, how does the theology evolve away from Christianity? How does it become its own distinct thing?
Dr. Waleed traces what he calls a theological phase transition, and it centers on the linguistic analysis of two names that are central to the faith, Ahmed and Muhammad.
Now, I have always heard that those were just two interchangeable names for the exact same person, like Jim and James. Just two ways to refer to the prophet.
The tradition treats them as interchangeable, but linguistically they serve two very different grammatical functions. Dr. Waleed argues they represent two distinct phases of a theological movement evolving in real time.
Okay, break that down.
Ahmed is a comparative adjective in Arabic. It means the one who praises most or more praiseworthy.
So it describes an action, someone who is doing a lot of praising.
Yes. In this early Ahmed phase, Dr. Waleed argues, the movement was essentially a reformist sect. He was acting as a reformer carrying forward Christ's message, praising God for the revelations of the past, trying to purify the Monophysite faith, perhaps pushing back against the corruption of the Byzantine Church.
So he's working within the existing framework.
Right. He was the one praising God among the unscriptured Arabs.
But reform movements usually either fizzle out or they break away and become something new.
And that is the transition to the Muhammad phase. As the movement crystallizes, as the political break with Byzantium becomes permanent, and as the Quranic revelations form a massive, comprehensive new scripture specifically for the Arabs, the title shifts to Muhammad.
And mechanically, what does the word Muhammad mean?
It is the passive participle. It means the praised one.
Oh, I see the shift.
Yes, it shifts from the man who is praising the old scriptures to the man who is praised for possessing the final overarching scripture. If you connect this to the bigger picture we've been painting, Dr. Waleed sees early Islam not as a sudden, completely alien religion erupting out of nowhere among desert pagans.
Right.
He sees it as a natural, albeit radical, internal Abrahamic reform movement that began among the Christian Ghassanid Arabs, separated due to political betrayal, and evolved into its own distinct, finalized revelation.
It is an evolution. It's a localized theological divergence that scales up into a global religion.
Precisely.
But, okay, if this is all true, if this incredibly neat, logically sound sequence of events happened in the Levant with Ghassanids and Byzantines, and it was a reform movement rooted in that specific cultural world,
Yeah.
why does the entire modern world know a completely different story?
That is the million-dollar question.
Like, if I ask anyone on the street about the origins of Islam, they'll say Mecca, Medina, the Hijazi Desert, the pagan Quraysh, the camel caravans. If Dr. Waleed is right about the geography and the players, someone had to have deliberately, systematically changed the narrative on a staggering scale.
And Dr. Waleed points his finger directly at the architects of that change. He argues that the narrative was rewritten by the Abbasid dynasty.
The Abbasids, okay, we need to bring them into the light. Who are they? When do they take power? And why on earth would they go to the trouble of rewriting the origin story of their own religion?
The Abbasids overthrow the Umayyad dynasty in 750 AD. This is roughly 120 years after the death of the Prophet.
Okay, so a century later.
Right. The Abbasids launched their violent, incredibly successful revolution from a region called Khorasan, which is in the Far East, in modern-day Iran and Central Asia. They're heavily backed by Persian, formerly Sassanid interests, who resented Arab Umayyad rule from Damascus.
Oh, wait, Persian Sassanid interests. You mean the same faction that lost the Great War to the Byzantines and the Ghassanids a century earlier?
Precisely. Dr. Waleed views the Abbasid revolution as essentially the geopolitical revenge of the old Sassanid-Lakhmid alliance.
Oh, wow. The long game.
The very long game. After a century of simmering resentment, the East finally rose up and slaughtered the Umayyads, who represented that old Western Byzantine Ghassanid power structure. They wiped out the Umayyad ruling family almost entirely.
So the empire strikes back.
Yeah.
The East conquers the West.
Yes. And once the Abbasids took total, absolute power, Dr. Waleed argues they had three massive existential motives to completely rewrite history.
Okay, let's hear the motives.
First, they needed to break the umbilical cord connecting Islam to Byzantine and Ghassanid Christianity. The Abbasids were fighting massive border wars with the Byzantine Empire.
Right.
They could not have their foundational religious texts and their prophet tied historically to the very empire they were currently trying to destroy. The theology had to be cleansed of Roman taint.
That makes perfect political sense. You can't tell your soldiers that the founder of your religion used to work for the enemy emperor. What is the second motive?
Geography. They needed to move the center of the world away from the Levant. Jerusalem and Damascus were Umayyad power bases. They were filled with Umayyad loyalists and Byzantine architecture.
So they needed a new capital.
Exactly. The Abbasids built a brand new, magnificent capital in the east, Baghdad. To legitimize their rule, they had to rhetorically and historically shift the gravity of the empire eastward, away from the Mediterranean.
Then the third motive.
Theology and persona. They needed to turn Muhammad from a literate, Ghassanid political reformer deeply embedded in Levantine Christian politics into an illiterate, isolated, miraculous figure in the deep desert.
Well, why?
By making him a desert pagan who suddenly, miraculously received the perfected word of God in a vacuum, they completely severed any theological ties to the messy, complicated Christian history of the Levant. It made the revelation purely divine, totally untouched by human geopolitics.
I mean, if Dr. Waleed is right about this, this is without a doubt the most successful PR campaign, the most massive geopolitical spin operation in the history of human civilization. It is breathtaking.
It truly is.
But here's my problem. How do you actually pull that off? It's one thing to want to change history. It's another to actually rewrite the memory of an entire civilization before the invention of the printing press.
Yeah.
How do you do it without everyone noticing?
You do it through two main mechanisms of state control. The first is absolute monopoly on the pen.
The pen.
Think about who actually wrote the histories we rely on today. The foundational texts of Islamic history, the biography by Ibn Ishaq, the military chronicles of Waqidi, the massive historical encyclopedia of Tabari, none of these were written contemporaneously. They were all written 100 to 300 years after the events took place.
So there's a massive gap in the written record.
A huge gap. And crucially, who employed these men? Ibn Ishaq, Waqidi, Tabari, they were all elite scholars living in Iraq, directly employed and sponsored by the Abbasid court in Baghdad.
I see the conflict of interest.
Dr. Waleed argues they were not independent, objective historians. They were state contractors. They were commissioned to write a state-sanctioned history that projected Abbasid geography, Abbasid theology, and Abbasid political needs backward in time.
It's exactly like if the entire history of the American Revolution was only allowed to be written in the 1970s, exclusively by historians employed by the Soviet Union, using sources only approved by the Kremlin. You are going to get a very specific, retroactively engineered version of George Washington that serves the needs of the current regime.
That is a perfect analogy. The Abbasids controlled the scholars, so they controlled the past. But the second mechanism is even more drastic, and it goes back to where we started. The physical geography.
Right.
To make the new history stick, they literally had to change the map. And here, Dr. Waleed heavily incorporates the highly controversial but incredibly fascinating findings of a researcher named Dan Gibson.
Yes. Dan Gibson, the Qibla guy.
Mm-hmm.
I have read a little bit about this. It is wild stuff. Explain his research for people who haven't heard of it.
Dan Gibson spent years analyzing the Qiblas, which is the physical direction that a mosque faces for prayer of the absolute earliest surviving Islamic structures around the world.
And what did he find?
His findings were explosive. He claims that for roughly the first century of Islam, the earliest mosques did not point toward the Mecca we know today in Saudi Arabia.
Where did they point?
They pointed to Petra, the ancient rock-carved city in southern Jordan, right back in the Levant.
Which perfectly aligns with Dr. Waleed's 200-kilometer Levantine theater of operations.
Exactly. Dr. Waleed integrates Gibson's physical data directly into his framework. He argues that the city of Bakka, which is mentioned in the Quran as the first house of worship, was actually a reference to Jerusalem.
Wow.
And the term Mecca originally referred to Petra, which was the great trading hub of the Nabateans, a major center for the Arab Federates, and a city heavily involved in the early conflicts.
But if the original holy city was Petra or Jerusalem, what happened to the real Mecca? The one in the Hijaz where millions of people go for Hajj today. How do you move a holy city?
According to this theory, you do it during a period of massive civil war and generational turnover. During the early Abbasid era, to permanently break the power of the Levant, they literally shifted the official Qibla.
Just told everyone to pray somewhere else?
Yes. They engineered and heavily funded a brand new Hajj pilgrimage route southward to a newly established isolated desert town in the Hijaz, which they christened as Mecca.
But wouldn't people notice? Wouldn't grandfathers tell their grandsons? Like, hey, we used to walk north to pray. Why are we walking south?
People did notice, which is why there were massive civil wars and rebellions during this period. But if you have absolute military control, if you destroy the old texts, and if you wait for the older generation to die off, well, within 2 or 3 generations, the new reality becomes the ancient tradition.
That's chilling.
By moving the holiest site on earth into the deep desert of the Hijaz, the Abbasids controlled the narrative, they controlled the lucrative pilgrimage economy, and they, forever, permanently severed Islam's geographic and historical roots from the Byzantine Levant.
They literally moved the map. They took the center of the world, picked it up, and dropped it hundreds of miles into the sand to fit a political narrative. It is mind-boggling to think about the sheer logistical and psychological audacity of that.
It is a breathtaking claim. It challenges the foundations of Orthodox history. But Dr. Waleed's framework insists that if you look at the gaping holes in the traditional narrative, the lack of archaeological evidence in the Hijaz, the silence of the contemporary observers, and you weigh it against the overwhelming evidence in the Levant.
The continuous coinage, the unbroken administration, the early non-Muslim texts.
Exactly. It is the only logical way to resolve that glaring geographic anomaly we started with. It is the only way the puzzle pieces actually fit together without forcing them.
It really does make you wonder. It forces you to take a huge step back and reflect on how information reaches us, even today. If an entire empire's history, its geography, the very birthplace of its founder, could be overwritten, edited, and successfully cemented as absolute truth before the printing press. I mean, how much of what we accept today as foundational, unquestionable truth is actually just the carefully constructed narrative of the victor? This deep dive really challenges you as a consumer of history to always look at the text and ask, who holds the pen? And who paid the guy holding it?
That is the essential, terrifying question of all historical study. And to leave you, the listener, with one final, deeply provocative thought derived from Dr. Waleed's massive framework, consider the fate of the Umayyad state in Andalusia in Spain.
Right. When the Abbasids took over and slaughtered the Umayyad ruling family in Damascus, one prince managed to escape the bloodbath. He fled all the way across North Africa and founded a massive, surviving Umayyad state in Spain, the Caliphate of Cordoba.
Exactly. They survived.
Yeah.
So if Dr. Waleed is right and the Abbasids in Baghdad were busy rewriting the history and moving the map, well, why didn't the Andalusian Umayyads, who were the bitter, blood-feud enemies of the Abbasids, why didn't it preserve the true Levantine geography?
Oh, that's interesting.
Why didn't they write their own books, calling out the Abbasid lie and saying, no, the prophet was from the Levant, we were there?
Oh, man, that's a really good point.
Right.
If they hated the Abbasids, why not expose them? Why did the Spanish Umayyads go along with the fake desert narrative?
Because they were caught in a brutal geopolitical trap. Think about their position. They are isolated in Europe, surrounded by hostile, encroaching Christian kingdoms like the Franks and the northern Spanish monarchs.
Right.
The Andalusian Umayyads desperately needed religious legitimacy. They needed to prove to their own diverse population and to the wider Islamic world looking on that they were the true Orthodox Muslims, not the usurping Abbasids in Baghdad.
I see where this is going.
Ironically, tragically, to prove their unquestionable piety, they had to adopt and fiercely cement the very desert narrative their mortal enemies had just invented.
Wow.
They couldn't afford to admit their roots were deeply tied to Byzantine Christianity while they were actively fighting European Christians for their very survival on the Iberian Peninsula. It would have destroyed their legitimacy.
So they just accepted it.
And so The last people on Earth who had the motive and the memory to correct the map were forced to accept it. They codified the abased lie to survive, a geopolitical trap that sealed the fate of history forever.